Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison thought he was just driving a supply truck through the mountains of Afghanistan when sniper fire erupted from the ridgeline above. What happened next would reveal that the quiet driver everyone had dismissed as just another gear hauler was actually one of the most decorated combat veterans in the entire theater of operations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jake had been driving supply runs for the 3rd Infantry Division for 8 months. And to everyone around Forward Operating Base Chapman, he was just another face in the motor pool. At 34, he was older than most of the soldiers, with graying temples and a weathered face that spoke of too many deployments and too little sleep. He wore standard-issue ACS that were always perfectly pressed, but never flashy, drove his assigned M1078 truck with methodical precision, and spoke only when spoken to during the daily convoy briefings. The younger soldiers assumed he was career military who had peaked at staff sergeant and was content to ride out his remaining years hauling MREs and ammunition between bases. He never talked about previous deployments, never shared war stories during chow time, and never tried to assert authority over anyone despite his rank. When new replacements arrived and asked about Morrison, the standard response was always the same: solid driver, keeps to himself, does his job without complaints. Just another lifer running out the clock until retirement. What nobody knew, what Jake had never mentioned to a single person on the base, was that he was on his 7th combat deployment across 3 different theaters of war. His personnel file, buried somewhere in the depths of military bureaucracy, contained his silver star, 2 bronze stars with V device for valor, a Purple Heart, and commendations from commanders in Iraq, Syria, and 2 previous tours in Afghanistan. But Jake Morrison had learned long ago that reputation could be a burden as much as a blessing. His first 5 deployments had been with special operations units, leading high-risk missions behind enemy lines, calling in airstrikes on terrorist compounds, and training indigenous forces in counterinsurgency tactics. He had been the kind of soldier that colonels sought out for impossible missions, and that junior officers studied in leadership courses. But those years had taken their toll in ways that medals and ribbons could never capture. The breaking point had come during his 6th deployment, when a mission he had planned and led resulted in the deaths of 3 soldiers under his command. The investigation cleared him of any wrongdoing, but Jake knew that numbers on a casualty report couldn't measure the weight of decisions made in split seconds under enemy fire. The families of those soldiers would never see their loved ones again because of choices he had made, and no amount of tactical analysis or after-action reviews could change that reality. So when his re-enlistment came up, Jake had made a conscious decision to step back from the front lines. He requested assignment to a logistics unit, took a reduction in responsibilities, and deliberately sought out the kind of routine, unglamorous work that kept him busy without putting other soldiers' lives in his hands. Driving supply trucks was honest work that served the mission without requiring the kind of life and death leadership that haunted his dreams. The transition had been jarring in ways he hadn't expected. After years of being the go-to guy for complex operations, being treated as just another driver felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Junior officers who would have sought his counsel on tactical matters now barely acknowledged his presence beyond signing off on his convoy manifests. Enlisted soldiers who would have competed for spots on his team now saw him as a peer at best, and more often as someone who had probably never seen real combat. Jake found himself living in a strange kind of limbo where his actual experience was inversely proportional to how others perceived his capabilities. The more he tried to blend into the background, the more invisible he became to everyone around him. It was exactly what he had wanted, but it came with an isolation that was deeper than anything he had experienced in the most remote outposts of his previous deployments. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the convoy commander who had arrived at Forward Chapman 3 weeks earlier, fresh out of the transportation officer basic course, exemplified this dynamic perfectly. At 23, she was eager to prove herself in her first combat deployment and determined to run the most efficient supply operation in the region. She studied convoy procedures with academic precision, memorized threat assessments with the dedication of someone who had never seen an IED crater, and treated every mission briefing like a test she was determined to pass. To Lieutenant Chun, Staff Sergeant Morrison was exactly what his file indicated: a competent but unremarkable NCO with adequate driving skills and a clean safety record. She noted that he always arrived early for briefings, maintained his vehicle properly, and followed orders without question. But she also observed that he never contributed tactical insights during planning sessions and seemed content to let junior soldiers take leadership roles during convoy preparations. What she didn't realize was that Jake was deliberately holding back. During mission briefings, when she would outline routes that he knew from experience were vulnerable to ambush, he would sit quietly rather than speak up and risk revealing the depth of his knowledge. When she would assign defensive positions that he could see were tactically unsound, he would accept his assignment without comment, knowing that offering corrections would invite questions about how he had acquired such expertise. The other drivers in the unit followed Jake's lead in treating Lieutenant Chun with respectful deference while privately questioning some of her decisions. Sergeant Tommy Reyes, a 26-year-old from El Paso on his second deployment, had developed a grudging respect for Morrison's steady competence, but assumed the older sergeant was playing it safe because he was close to retirement. Corporal Amanda Foster, a 22-year-old mechanic from Ohio who sometimes rode shotgun on supply runs, appreciated that Morrison never talked down to her like some of the other NCOs did, but she attributed his respectful manner to him being less confident in his authority than more aggressive leaders. The dynamic created a situation where Jake was simultaneously respected for his reliability and underestimated for his capabilities. He had achieved exactly what he set out to accomplish: a role where he could serve his country without bearing the responsibility for other soldiers' lives. But he hadn't anticipated how completely his deliberate anonymity would obscure his actual abilities, even from himself. As he performed his daily routine of pre-flight inspections, convoy preparations, and supply runs, Jake found himself wondering if he had gone too far in his attempt to step back from leadership. There were moments during mission briefings when his tactical instincts would scream warnings that he couldn't voice without revealing more about his background than he was prepared to share. There were times when he would see junior soldiers making mistakes that he could easily correct, but doing so would mean acknowledging a level of experience that would inevitably lead to questions about his previous assignments. The comfortable anonymity he had sought was becoming a kind of professional paralysis, where his most valuable skills were locked away behind a facade of deliberate mediocrity. But Jake had convinced himself that this was the price of stepping back from the kind of high-stakes leadership that had cost him too much sleep and too many friends. He was just a supply truck driver now, and that was exactly what he had chosen to be. He had no way of knowing that his carefully constructed anonymity was about to be shattered by a situation that would demand every skill he had spent months trying to forget. The mountain road ahead held challenges that would strip away all pretense and reveal exactly who Jake Morrison really was, whether he was ready for that revelation or not. The truth about Jake Morrison's military background read like something out of a commendation ceremony that most soldiers only dreamed of attending. His official record, locked away in classified personnel files at the Pentagon, painted the picture of a warrior who had spent the better part of a decade at the tip of the spear in America's most dangerous conflicts. Jake's military career had begun conventionally enough with basic training at Fort Benning, followed by advanced individual training as an infantryman. But even during those early months, his instructors had noticed something different about the quiet kid from rural Montana. While other recruits struggled with land navigation exercises, Jake seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of terrain and movement. While others panicked during live-fire exercises, he displayed a calm focus that impressed even veteran drill sergeants who had seen thousands of soldiers pass through their programs. His first deployment to Iraq in 2008 as a private first class had been with a standard infantry unit conducting routine patrols in Anbar province. But within 3 months, Jake had caught the attention of a special forces captain who was looking for soldiers with the right combination of tactical aptitude and psychological resilience for more specialized work. The captain had watched Jake navigate a complex ambush situation where his squad leader had been wounded, and had been impressed by how the young soldier had taken charge. Without being asked, coordinated effective suppressing fire, and called in a medical evacuation that saved 3 lives. The transition to special operations had opened doors that Jake never knew existed. His second deployment took him to Syria as part of a classified unit, training Kurdish fighters in advanced combat tactics. It was there that he first demonstrated the leadership abilities that would define the next phase of his career. Working with indigenous forces required a different kind of soldier than conventional operations, someone who could adapt American tactics to foreign fighters while building trust across cultural and language barriers. Jake had excelled in that environment in ways that surprised even his commanders. He learned enough Kurdish and Arabic to communicate directly with local fighters, developed training programs that accounted for their equipment limitations and tactical preferences, and built relationships that turned suspicious allies into dedicated partners. His reports from that deployment were still used as case studies in special operations training programs, though his name had been redacted from the versions used for instruction. The Silver Star had come during his third deployment, this time in Afghanistan's Kunar province, working with a Joint Special Operations Task Force. The citation, which remained classified, detailed how Staff Sergeant Morrison had led a 12-man team on a nighttime raid against a high-value target compound that intelligence indicated was housing a senior Taliban commander. When the mission went sideways due to faulty intelligence, and the team found themselves surrounded by a much larger enemy force, Jake had coordinated a fighting withdrawal that lasted 6 hours and covered 12 kilometers of hostile terrain. What made his actions worthy of the Silver Star wasn't just the tactical excellence he displayed under extreme pressure, but the fact that he had voluntarily remained behind with 2 wounded soldiers when the rest of the team could have escaped more quickly without them. For 3 hours, Jake had held off advancing enemy fighters while coordinating helicopter gunship support and calling in artillery strikes danger close to his own position. All 12 members of his team had made it home alive, but Jake himself had been wounded by shrapnel from a mortar round that exploded less than 20 meters from his position. The Purple Heart ceremony had been conducted in a field hospital, where Jake was recovering from surgery to remove metal fragments from his shoulder and back. He had insisted that the medal be presented privately, without media coverage or fanfare, because he believed that drawing attention to individual heroics diminished the contributions of his entire team. It was a perspective that would characterize his approach to recognition throughout his career, always deflecting credit to others and minimizing his own role in successful operations. His 4th deployment had taken him back to Iraq during the height of the ISIS conflict, where he served as a senior advisor to Iraqi Special Forces units conducting urban combat operations in Mosul and Fallujah. The Bronze Stars with V device had been earned during that tour, recognizing his actions during 2 separate engagements where his tactical guidance and personal courage under fire had been instrumental in mission success. The first Bronze Star came after Jake had accompanied an Iraqi unit on a raid against an ISIS bomb-making facility in eastern Mosul, when the Iraqi commander was killed by sniper fire in the opening minutes of the assault. Jake had taken tactical control of the entire operation despite having no formal authority over the Iraqi soldiers. Using a combination of broken Arabic, hand signals, and personal example, he had led the assault through a maze of booby-trapped buildings, coordinated close air support from American fighters, and personally cleared 3 rooms where ISIS fighters were making their final stand. The second Bronze Star had been even more hard-earned. During an operation to rescue a group of captured Iraqi police officers who were being held in an ISIS prison compound, Jake had volunteered to lead the initial breach team, knowing that the first soldiers through the door would face the heaviest resistance. When the breach charge failed to fully demolish the reinforced entrance, Jake had manually cleared the remaining obstacles while under direct fire, creating an opening for the assault team to pour through and overwhelm the defenders. Both actions had been captured on helmet cameras worn by other team members, and the footage had been used in briefings at the highest levels of command to illustrate effective small unit leadership under extreme conditions. But Jake had requested that his identity be kept confidential in any subsequent analysis or training materials, preferring to let the tactical lessons speak for themselves without personal attribution. His 5th deployment had brought him to Syria. Again, this time working with a multinational task force, hunting high-value targets associated with various terrorist organizations. It was during this tour that Jake's reputation within the special operations community had truly crystallized. He was the NCO that colonels specifically requested for their most sensitive missions, the soldier that junior officers studied to understand what effective leadership looked like under pressure. The missions themselves remained classified years later, but Jake's efficiency reports from that period painted a picture of a soldier operating at the absolute peak of his profession. He was described as having an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements. His tactical plans were studied and copied by other units. His ability to lead soldiers from different countries and military traditions was considered exceptional even within the elite community of special operations professionals. But it was also during this deployment that Jake began to show the first signs of the psychological strain that would eventually drive him to seek a different path. The intensity of continuous high-risk operations, the responsibility for making life-and-death decisions on a daily basis, and the accumulated weight of seeing too many friends wounded or killed began to take a toll that no amount of professional success could offset. His 6th deployment, the one that would ultimately change everything, had been to Afghanistan's Helmand province, working with British Special Air Service and Australian Special Air Service Regiment units in a joint counterinsurgency operation. By this point, Jake was a senior staff sergeant with a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Commanders competed to have him assigned to their units. Junior officers sought his mentorship. Enlisted soldiers considered assignment to his team a career-defining opportunity. The mission that broke him had seemed routine by the standards he had become accustomed to. Intelligence had identified a Taliban commander who was coordinating attacks against coalition supply convoys, and Jake's team had been tasked with capturing or killing the target in a small village in the Sangin district. The planning had been meticulous, the intelligence had seemed solid, and the execution had gone exactly according to plan in its initial phases. But war has a way of making even the best plans irrelevant, and what should have been a textbook operation had turned into a nightmare that still haunted Jake's dreams years later. The intelligence had been partially correct, but fatally incomplete. Yes, there was a Taliban commander in the village, but he was there for a wedding celebration that included dozens of civilians, including children. Yes, the compound they raided contained weapons and communications equipment, but it also contained a family gathering that had nothing to do with military operations. In the darkness and confusion of the assault, with split-second decisions required and incomplete information available, 3 civilians had been killed by Jake's team. An elderly man who had reached for what appeared to be a weapon but turned out to be a walking stick. A teenager who had been running toward what Jake's point man interpreted as a fighting position, but was actually trying to reach his younger sister. A woman who had been in the wrong room at the wrong time when a flashbang grate had caused more damage than intended. The subsequent investigation had cleared Jake and his team of any wrongdoing. The rules of engagement had been followed. The decisions made under fire had been reasonable given the information available. The mission had been a tactical success that removed a legitimate military target from the battlefield. But none of that official vindication could change the fact that Jake Morrison had been the leader whose decisions had resulted in the deaths of innocent people. That realization had fundamentally altered Jake's relationship with his own capabilities and reputation. The skills that had made him exceptional at his job, the judgment that commanders trusted with their most critical missions, the leadership abilities that had saved countless American and Allied lives, had also led directly to a tragedy that no amount of tactical success could justify. He began to question whether the qualities that made him valuable as a special operations soldier were worth the human cost that seemed inevitably attached to them. The decision to step away from special operations and seek assignment to a conventional logistics unit had been Jake's attempt to find a way to continue serving his country without bearing the kind of responsibility that had proven too heavy for his conscience to carry. He wanted to be useful without being indispensable, competent without being exceptional, reliable without being irreplaceable. But as he would soon discover, some skills and instincts cannot be simply turned off or ignored when circumstances demand their use. The quiet supply truck driver that everyone at Forward Chapman knew was about to be tested in ways that would strip away all pretense and reveal exactly who he really was, regardless of his own preferences or intentions. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman 3 weeks earlier with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from never having been shot at. Fresh from the transportation officer basic course at Fort Lee, she carried herself with the precise military bearing of someone who had studied leadership from textbooks and was eager to apply theoretical knowledge to real-world situations. At 23, she was the youngest officer on the base and acutely aware that her authority came from her rank rather than her experience. Sarah's path to military service had been as methodical as everything else in her life. The daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had built a successful engineering firm in San Francisco, she had grown up in a household where excellence was expected and mediocrity was not tolerated. Her parents had initially hoped she would follow them into engineering, but Sarah had been drawn to military service by a combination of patriotic duty and a desire to prove herself in an environment where success couldn't be attributed to family connections or inherited advantages. West Point had been her first choice, but her application had been rejected despite stellar academics and extracurricular achievements. The disappointment had only strengthened her resolve to excel in whatever path the military offered her. She had enlisted immediately after graduating from UC Berkeley with a degree in business administration, excelled in every phase of her training, and earned her commission through officer candidate. School with honors. The transportation corps had not been her preferred branch, but Sarah had approached it with the same dedication she brought to everything else. She studied convoy operations with the intensity of a doctoral candidate, memorized every regulation and procedure until she could recite them verbatim, and arrived at FOB Chapman convinced that proper planning and execution could overcome any challenge the enemy might present. What Sarah lacked in combat experience, she tried to compensate for with thorough preparation and attention to detail. She spent hours analyzing route studies, studying intelligence reports, and planning contingencies for every conceivable scenario. Her convoy briefings were models of military precision, complete with detailed maps, comprehensive risk assessments, and carefully rehearsed emergency procedures. The problem was that Sarah's academic approach to leadership created a certain rigidity. in her thinking that more experienced soldiers could sense immediately. She had learned the right answers to hypothetical problems, but had never faced the chaos of real combat, where textbook solutions often proved inadequate. Her confidence in her own preparation was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. Sergeant Tommy Reyes had been watching Lieutenant Chen's leadership style with the kind of polite skepticism that comes from having served under both competent and incompetent officers during his 6-year military career. At 26, Tommy was on his second deployment to Afghanistan and had developed the cynical wisdom that keeps enlisted soldiers alive when their leaders are learning on the job. Tommy had grown up in El Paso, where the military was one of the few paths to economic advancement for kids from working-class families. He had joined the Army straight out of high school with no particular career goals beyond steady employment and college benefits. But military service had suited him better than he had expected, and he had discovered a talent for logistics coordination. That made him valuable to commanders who needed reliable NCOs to keep supply operations running smoothly. His first deployment had been to Iraq in 2018, where he had learned the difference between military theory and battlefield reality. That tour had taught him to recognize the signs of inexperienced leadership and to quietly compensate for officers who were still figuring out how to translate their training into effective decision-making. Tommy had developed a reputation as someone who could make things work regardless of the challenges, but he had also learned to keep his opinions about command decisions to himself unless directly asked. With Lieutenant Chun, Tommy found himself in the familiar position of serving under an officer who was technically competent but practically inexperienced. He respected her work ethic and attention to detail, but he could see gaps in her understanding that worried him. Her route planning relied heavily on intelligence assessments that Tommy knew from experience were often incomplete or outdated. Her confidence in communication procedures assumed that radios would work perfectly and that enemy forces would behave predictably. Most concerning to Tommy was Lieutenant Chun's tendency to stick rigidly to predetermined plans even when circumstances changed. During training exercises, she had shown little flexibility when faced with unexpected developments, preferring to execute her original plan rather than adapt to new information. In a garrison environment, this inflexibility was merely inefficient. In a combat zone, it could be deadly. Corporal Amanda Foster represented the newest generation of soldiers serving in Afghanistan, part of a cohort that had grown up during the War on Terror but had limited understanding of its origins or strategic objectives. At 22, she was a skilled mechanic whose technical expertise was essential to keeping the unit's vehicles operational, but her tactical knowledge was limited to the basic combat training she had received before deployment. Amanda had joined the Army primarily for the technical training and educational benefits it offered. Growing up in a small Ohio town where opportunities were limited, military service had provided her with advanced mechanical training that would translate into valuable civilian skills after her enlistment ended. She approached her duties with professional competence, but without the deeper understanding of military culture and combat operations that characterized more experienced soldiers. What Amanda brought to the unit was a fresh perspective, uncomplicated by previous combat experiences or preconceived notions about how things should be done. She followed orders without question, maintained her equipment to the highest standards, and treated everyone with the same straightforward respect regardless of their rank or experience. Her mechanical skills had already saved several convoy missions when vehicles broke down in remote locations, earning her the respect of soldiers who might otherwise have dismissed her youth and inexperience. But Amanda's limited tactical knowledge also made her vulnerable to dangers that more experienced soldiers would recognize instinctively. She had never been in a firefight, never experienced the chaos and confusion of combat, and had only a theoretical understanding of how quickly routine missions could turn deadly. Her confidence in her own abilities was based on controlled training. environments that bore little resemblance to the unpredictable realities of asymmetric warfare. The dynamic between these three soldiers and Staff Sergeant Morrison illustrated the complex relationships that develop within military units deployed to combat zones. Lieutenant Chun saw Morrison as a reliable but unremarkable NCO whose competence she took for granted, but whose expertise she never thought to tap. Sergeant Reyes respected Morrison's steady professionalism, but assumed his quiet demeanor indicated a lack of tactical knowledge or leadership ambition. Corporal Foster appreciated Morrison's respectful manner, but had no context for understanding what his experience might represent. None of them realized that they were serving alongside someone whose tactical knowledge exceeded that of most company commanders, whose combat experience spanned multiple theaters and conflict types, and whose reputation within the special operations community was legendary. Jake's deliberate anonymity had been so successful that he had become invisible even to soldiers who worked with him daily. This invisibility was exactly what Jake had sought when he requested assignment to a logistics unit, but it came with unintended consequences that were becoming increasingly apparent. During convoy briefings, he would sit quietly while Lieutenant Chen outlined routes that his experience told him were vulnerable to ambush. When Sergeant Reyes expressed concerns about vehicle maintenance schedules, Jake could have shared insights from years of operating in similar conditions, but doing so would have raised questions about his background that he preferred to avoid. Most problematically, Jake's self-imposed silence meant that his unit was operating without the benefit of knowledge that could potentially save their lives. His understanding of enemy tactics, his ability to read terrain for defensive advantages, and his experience with convoy security procedures could have made their missions safer and more effective. But his desire to avoid the leadership responsibilities that had haunted his previous deployment kept him from sharing information that he knew could be valuable. The contradiction at the heart of Jake's situation was becoming more apparent with each mission. He had stepped back from special operations to avoid the responsibility for other soldiers' lives, but his current assignment still placed him in situations where his knowledge and experience could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The very skills he was trying to leave behind were exactly what his current unit needed most, even though none of them realized it. Lieutenant Chun's confidence in her own planning abilities meant that she rarely sought input from enlisted personnel, assuming that her officer training and detailed preparation were sufficient for any challenges they might face. Sergeant Reyes had learned to work within the limitations of inexperienced leadership, but he had no way of knowing that one of his fellow NCOs possessed knowledge that could address many of his concerns. Corporal Foster trusted that her leaders knew what they were doing, unaware that the most experienced soldier in the unit was deliberately keeping his expertise to himself. This dynamic created a dangerous situation where the unit was preparing for missions without accessing the best available knowledge about the threats they would face. Jake's tactical understanding of enemy ambush techniques, his experience with convoy security in similar terrain, and his ability to anticipate likely attack scenarios were all being wasted because of his determination to maintain a low profile. The irony was that Jake's attempt to escape the burden of leadership had placed him in a position where his silence could potentially lead to exactly the kind of casualties he was trying to avoid. His knowledge of how insurgent forces operated in Afghanistan, his understanding of tactical vulnerabilities in convoy operations, and his experience with emergency procedures could have made his unit significantly more effective at avoiding and responding to threats, but sharing that knowledge would have required Jake to acknowledge a level of expertise that would inevitably lead to questions about his background and previous assignments. It would have meant accepting a leadership role that he was psychologically unprepared to resume. Most importantly, it would have meant taking responsibility for tactical decisions that could affect the lives and safety of his fellow soldiers. As the unit prepared for another routine supply mission, None of them could have anticipated that circumstances were about to force Jake Morrison to choose between maintaining his carefully constructed anonymity and using his skills to save the lives of soldiers who had no idea they were serving alongside one of the most experienced combat veterans in the entire theater of operations. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late September, during what should have been a routine supply run to combat Outpost Keating, a small forward position nestled in the mountains about 40 kilometers northeast of Forward Chapman. Lieutenant Chun had planned the mission with her usual meticulous attention to detail, studying satellite imagery, reviewing intelligence reports, and coordinating with air support assets that would be available if needed. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles, 2 M1078 cargo trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies, 1 MATV for security, and Lieutenant Chun's command vehicle equipped with enhanced communication equipment. Jake Morrison was assigned to drive the lead cargo truck, with Corporal Foster riding as his assistant driver and vehicle commander. Sergeant Reyes commanded the trail truck, while Lieutenant Chen positioned herself in the security vehicle where she could maintain communication with higher headquarters and coordinate the convoy's movement. The route to Cop Keating followed Highway 7 through the Cunner River Valley before turning onto a narrow mountain road that climbed through a series of switchbacks to reach the outpost. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in the area over the past 2 weeks, and the mission was classified as routine with a low probability of enemy contact. Lieutenant Chun had requested helicopter escort as a precautionary measure, but her request had been denied due to higher priority missions requiring aviation assets elsewhere. Jake studied the route during the pre-mission briefing and immediately recognized several potential problems that Lieutenant Chun's analysis had overlooked. The mountain road included a section where the convoy would be forced to slow to less than 15 kilometers per hour while navigating tight curves with steep drop-offs on one side and rocky walls on the other. There were at least 3 locations where the road crossed exposed ridgelines that would provide excellent fields of fire for enemy observers or snipers. Most concerning to Jake was a stretch of road about halfway to the objective, where the route passed through a narrow valley with high ground on both sides. His experience in similar terrain told him that this area was ideal for a complex ambush, where enemy forces could position themselves on the heights and engage the convoy with small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices simultaneously from multiple directions. But Jake remained silent during the briefing, listening as Lieutenant Chun outlined her assessment of the threats and her plans for responding to various contingencies. Her analysis was technically correct but lacked the intuitive understanding of enemy tactics that comes from actual combat experience. She had identified the same terrain features that concerned Jake, but she had dismissed them as manageable risks based on the low enemy activity reports and the convoy's planned speed of movement. When Lieutenant Chun asked if there were any questions or concerns about the mission, Jake felt the familiar internal struggle between his desire to remain anonymous and his professional obligation to share relevant knowledge. Sergeant Reyes raised questions about vehicle spacing and communication procedures, which Lieutenant Chun answered with textbook precision. Corporal Foster asked about medical evacuation procedures if someone was wounded, receiving a detailed explanation of the closest helicopter landing zones and the process for requesting emergency medical support. Jake could have contributed valuable insights about convoy movement techniques in mountainous terrain, optimal spacing between vehicles to minimize casualties from ambush attacks, and tactical considerations for the specific route they would be traveling. But speaking up would have required him to explain how he had acquired such detailed knowledge, which would inevitably lead to questions about his previous assignments and combat experience. The internal conflict was intensified by Jake's growing respect for the soldiers he was serving with. Lieutenant Chun might be inexperienced, But her dedication to her soldiers' welfare was obvious in every aspect of her planning. Sergeant Reyes had demonstrated competence and reliability that made him exactly the kind of NCO that Jake would have wanted on his team during his special operations years. Corporal Foster's technical skills and professional attitude reminded him of some of the best soldiers he had served with throughout his career. These were good people who deserved the benefit of his knowledge and experience. But Jake's psychological wounds from his previous deployment made it almost impossible for him to accept the leadership responsibilities that sharing his expertise would inevitably entail. Every time he considered speaking up, he was confronted by memories of the civilians who had died under his command. The weight of decisions that had gone wrong despite the best intentions and careful planning. The compromise Jake reached with himself was to remain extra vigilant during the mission and to be prepared to act if circumstances required his intervention, while still avoiding the proactive leadership role that had caused him so much psychological anguish. He would do his job as a driver and trust that Lieutenant Chun's planning would be sufficient to get them through the mission safely. The convoy departed Forward Chapman at 0630 hours, with Jake's truck taking the lead position as planned. The first part of the journey along Highway 7 proceeded without incident, with Lieutenant Chun maintaining regular radio contact with all vehicles and providing updates on their progress to the Tactical Operations Center. The morning was clear and cool, with good visibility in all directions and no signs of unusual activity along the route. Jake drove with the mechanical precision that had characterized all his duties since arriving at Forward Chapman, maintaining the prescribed speed and following the exact route that Lieutenant Chun had outlined during her briefing. But his eyes were constantly scanning the terrain ahead, looking for signs of disturbance that might indicate improvised explosive devices, checking the high ground for potential sniper positions, and monitoring the behavior of local civilians, who might provide early warning of enemy activity. 20 minutes into the mission, as they approached the turnoff onto the mountain road that would take them to Cop Keating, Jake noticed the first sign that something might be wrong. A small village that intelligence reports indicated should have normal morning activity appeared to be completely deserted. No children playing in the streets, no women hanging laundry, no men working in the small fields that surrounded the cluster of mud brick houses. In his experience, empty villages in Afghanistan often meant that local civilians had received advance warning of planned enemy activity and had removed themselves from potential danger areas. But the intelligence briefing had indicated no known enemy presence in the region, and Lieutenant Chun's route analysis had dismissed the village as a low-risk area, based on previous friendly interactions with local inhabitants. Jake keyed his radio to report the observation to Lieutenant Chun, but hesitated before transmitting. Pointing out the significance of the empty village would require him to explain his interpretation based on combat experience that officially didn't exist. Instead, he settled for a simple factual report that avoided any tactical analysis. Lead vehicle to command. The village appears to be unoccupied. No civilian activity observed. Lieutenant Chun acknowledged the report with professional calm, noting the information but not changing the convoy's movement plan. From her perspective, an empty village might indicate any number of factors unrelated to enemy activity. Perhaps the inhabitants were working in fields outside the village, or attending a local gathering, or simply going about their daily routines in areas not visible from the road. Jake's concern deepened as they began climbing the mountain road toward Cop Keating. The terrain became increasingly rugged, with steep rocky slopes on both sides of the narrow roadway and limited visibility around the tight switchback curves. Vehicle speed dropped to less than 20 kilometers per hour as the truck struggled with the steep grade and treacherous road conditions. 15 minutes later, Jake spotted the second warning sign that his special operations experience told him indicated likely enemy activity. A small herd of goats that should have been grazing on the hillside above the road had been moved to lower ground, away from the route the convoy would travel. Local herders in Afghanistan often received advance warning from insurgent forces to move their animals away from areas where attacks were planned, both to protect the livestock and to avoid civilian casualties that might turn local opinion against the fighters. Again, Jake found himself struggling with the decision about whether to report his concerns to Lieutenant Chun. The evidence was circumstantial and based on patterns that might not be apparent to someone without extensive combat experience in the region. Reporting his suspicions would require him to explain the significance of seemingly innocuous details that most soldiers would never notice. The internal debate was resolved when Corporal Foster, riding in the passenger seat of Jake's truck, made an observation that provided him with an opening to share his concerns without revealing the depth of his tactical knowledge. "Sergeant Morrison, doesn't it seem weird that we haven't seen any people this whole morning? I mean, when we drove this route last month, there were people everywhere." Jake seized the opportunity to validate her observation while subtly introducing his own concerns. "You're right, Corporal. Empty villages and missing livestock can sometimes indicate local civilians have been warned about potential trouble. Might be worth passing that up to the lieutenant." Foster nodded and keyed her radio to report the observation to Lieutenant Chun, who acknowledged the information with the same professional calm she had shown earlier. But Jake could hear a slight tension in her voice that suggested she was beginning to recognize that the pattern of signs might indicate a developing threat situation. What none of them knew was that their convoy had been under observation since leaving Forward Chapman, tracked by a network of spotters who were reporting their progress to a Taliban unit positioned in the mountains ahead. The empty village and relocated livestock were indeed indicators of planned enemy activity. Exactly as Jake's experience had suggested, the ambush was waiting for them just ahead, positioned at the one point along their route where the convoy would be most vulnerable and where enemy forces would have the greatest tactical advantage. Jake's instincts were about to be proven correct in the most violent and dramatic way possible, forcing him to choose between maintaining his anonymity and using every skill he possessed to save the lives of soldiers who had no idea they were serving alongside one of the most experienced combat veterans in the entire theater of operations. The pattern of harassment began to crystallize over the following weeks as Jake's convoy missions continued with increasing frequency. Lieutenant Chun, still operating under the assumption that her textbook approach to leadership was sufficient for the challenges they faced, began assigning Jake to progressively more dangerous routes based solely on his clean safety record and reliable performance. What she didn't realize was that Jake's apparent competence was masking a level of tactical awareness that was keeping minor incidents from escalating into major disasters. The second mission that raised Jake's concerns occurred during the first week of October, when their convoy was tasked with delivering construction materials to Firebase Wilderness, a remote outpost being established to monitor Taliban infiltration routes from Pakistan. The route required traveling through the Peck River Valley, an area that Jake knew from his special operations days was a traditional corridor for enemy movement and supply operations. During the mission briefing, Lieutenant Chun outlined her plan with the same methodical precision she brought to every operation. Intelligence reports indicated scattered enemy activity in the region, but nothing that suggested coordinated threat to convoy operations. The route would take them through several villages where previous convoys had received friendly receptions from local inhabitants. Helicopter support would be available on 15-minute notice if needed. Jake studied the map and immediately recognized that their planned route would take them directly through an area where his previous unit had conducted multiple operations against Taliban forces. The valley contained numerous positions where enemy fighters could establish observation posts or ambush sites, and a winding road would force the convoy to move slowly through terrain that heavily favored defenders over attackers. But once again, Jake found himself unable to share his knowledge without revealing more about his background than he was prepared to discuss. His understanding of the tactical significance of specific terrain features, his knowledge of enemy operating patterns in the region, and his awareness of previous combat operations in the area all came from classified missions that he couldn't discuss with soldiers who lacked appropriate security clearances. The compromise Jake reached was to volunteer for additional duties that would position him to respond more effectively if problems developed. He requested permission to ride in the lead vehicle as convoy scout, a position that would allow him to identify potential threats early and communicate warnings to the rest of the convoy. Lieutenant Chun approved the request, interpreting Jake's initiative as commendable professional development rather than recognizing it as the tactical precaution it actually represented. Sergeant Reyes noticed Jake's increased involvement in mission planning and assumed it indicated renewed interest in advancing his military career. During their pre-mission equipment checks, Tommy commented on Jake's attention to detail and suggested that he might want to consider applying for promotion to sergeant, first class, or even pursuing warrant officer training. "You've got good instincts for this stuff, Morrison," Tommy said while inspecting the radios and communication equipment. "Better than a lot of NCOs I've served with. You ever think about taking on more responsibility?" Jake's response was carefully neutral, acknowledging the compliment while deflecting any suggestion that he was seeking advancement. "Just trying to do my job well, Sergeant. Make sure everybody gets home safe." But Tommy's observation was more perceptive than Jake realized. His years of combat experience had given him instincts and capabilities that were difficult to completely suppress, even when he was consciously trying to maintain a low profile. His situational awareness, his tactical thinking, and his leadership presence were gradually becoming apparent to soldiers who worked closely with him. Despite his best efforts to remain anonymous, Corporal Foster had also begun to notice that Jake's approach to convoy operations was more sophisticated than his quiet demeanor suggested. During vehicle inspections, he would check equipment and systems that other drivers typically overlooked. His pre-mission briefings were more thorough than required by standard operating procedures. Most tellingly, his reactions to unexpected situations during missions suggested a level of tactical understanding that seemed inconsistent with his apparent lack of ambition for leadership roles. "Sergeant Morrison always seems to know what's going to happen before it happens," Amanda mentioned to Tommy during a maintenance session. "Like yesterday when he told us to check our body armor before we even got the mission briefing. Turns out we were going through an area where there had been sniper activity the week before." Tommy had noticed the same pattern but had attributed it to Jake being naturally cautious rather than unusually knowledgeable. "He's probably just careful because he's been around long enough to know that stuff can go wrong fast. Better to be over-prepared than caught off guard." The conversation reflected a dynamic that was developing within the unit where Jake's competence was being recognized and appreciated, but its true source remained hidden. His fellow soldiers were beginning to rely on his judgment and trust his instincts, but they had no context for understanding why those instincts were so consistently accurate. Lieutenant Chun was also beginning to notice Jake's contributions, though she interpreted them through the lens of her own limited experience. She saw his initiative as evidence of professional growth, and his suggestions as indicators of developing tactical awareness. What she didn't recognize was that Jake's recommendations were based on combat experience that exceeded her own by several orders of magnitude. During a mission planning session for the Firebase Wilderness Convoy, Lieutenant Chun asked Jake for his assessment of the proposed route based on his experience as convoy scout. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Jake had been hoping to avoid, but declining to participate would have seemed suspicious and unprofessional. "The route looks good on paper, ma'am," Jake began carefully, "but I'd recommend increasing the spacing between vehicles when we're moving through the valley sections. If we hit an IED or take contact, Tighter spacing could mean multiple vehicles get caught in the kill zone. Lieutenant Chun nodded and made note of the recommendation, but pressed for more detailed analysis. What about our communication plan? Are there any dead zones we should be concerned about? Jake found himself walking a careful line between providing useful tactical advice and revealing more about his knowledge base than he intended. Mountain valleys can be tricky for radio communications, especially if we need to call for air support. Might be worth having a backup plan for getting emergency calls through to higher headquarters. The suggestions were tactically sound and professionally presented, but they represented only a fraction of the insights Jake could have provided if he had been willing to fully engage with the mission planning process. His knowledge of enemy tactics in the specific area they would be traveling, his understanding of optimal defensive positions if they were attacked, and his experience with emergency procedures in similar terrain could have significantly improved their chances of mission success. But sharing that level of detail would have required Jake to explain how he had acquired such specialized knowledge, which would inevitably lead to questions about his previous assignments and combat record. The psychological barriers that prevented him from accepting leadership responsibilities also made it nearly impossible for him to fully contribute his expertise to mission planning. The Firebase Wilderness mission proceeded according to Lieutenant Chun's plan, with Jake serving as convoy scout in the lead vehicle. For the first 2 hours, the journey was routine and uneventful, following the timeline and checkpoints that had been established during the planning phase. But as they entered the Peck River Valley, Jake began noticing signs that his special operations experience told him indicated potential enemy activity. The first warning sign was subtle, but unmistakable to someone with Jake's background. A small bridge that they needed to cross had been recently disturbed, with fresh earth around the support pillars that suggested possible placement of improvised explosive devices. Local civilians who should have been using the bridge for daily travel were avoiding the area, taking longer alternate routes that added significant time to their journeys. Jake reported his observations to Lieutenant Chun using carefully neutral language that avoided tactical interpretations. "Command, this is a scout. The bridge appears to have recent excavations around the support structures. No civilian traffic was observed in the immediate area." Lieutenant Chun's response reflected her textbook approach to threat assessment. "Copy. Scout, reduce speed and conduct visual inspection of the bridge structure. Report any suspicious objects or obvious signs of tampering." The inspection revealed no obvious explosive devices, but Jake's instincts continued to signal danger. The disturbance around the bridge supports was consistent with reconnaissance activity that might precede placement of IEDs. The absence of civilian traffic suggested that local inhabitants had been warned to avoid the area, which often indicated planned enemy operations. But without revealing the source of his concerns, Jake had no way to communicate the significance of these indicators to Lieutenant Chun. His report would necessarily be limited to observable facts rather than tactical analysis, leaving her to make decisions based on incomplete understanding of the threat environment. As the convoy continued through the valley, Jake spotted additional signs that reinforced his growing certainty that they were being observed and potentially targeted by enemy forces. A small group of military-age males who had been visible on a distant hillside when the convoy first entered the valley had disappeared from view, suggesting possible movement to positions that would provide better fields of fire. A herder who had been tending goats near the road had moved his animals away from the convoy route, behavior that Jake knew often preceded ambush attacks. The pattern of indicators was becoming overwhelming, but Jake found himself trapped between his tactical knowledge and his psychological limitations. Every instinct developed over 7 combat deployments was screaming that his convoy was moving into a carefully prepared ambush, but he lacked the emotional strength to assume the leadership role that would be required to effectively respond to the threat. The breaking point was approaching faster than anyone in the convoy realized, and Jake Morrison was about to be forced to choose between his desire for anonymity and his responsibility to the soldiers whose lives depended on skills he had spent months trying to forget. The ambush began at 13:47 hours local time, precisely when Jake's tactical instincts had warned him it would happen. The convoy had just entered the narrowest section of the Peck River Valley, where the road curved sharply between two steep ridgelines that rose nearly 300 meters above the valley floor. It was a textbook kill zone, the kind of terrain that military academies used as examples of where convoys were most vulnerable to coordinated attacks. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jake was driving the lead M1078 truck when the first rifle shot cracked across the valley, the distinctive sound of a Dragunov sniper rifle echoing off the rocky walls that surrounded them. The bullet struck the windshield of Lieutenant Chun's command vehicle, spider-webbing the armored glass but not penetrating the ballistic protection. Within seconds, the valley erupted in a symphony of automatic weapons fire as Taliban fighters, positioned on both ridgelines, opened fire with AK-47s, PKM machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. Contact left, contact right. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Lieutenant Chun's voice came over the radio with the high pitch of adrenaline and inexperience. Her textbook training had prepared her for the possibility of ambush, but the reality of bullets snapping overhead and RPGs exploding nearby was overwhelming her ability to process information and make tactical decisions. Jake's response was immediate and instinctive, drawing on reflexes developed over 7 combat deployments and countless firefights. He accelerated the heavy truck through the kill zone, while simultaneously keying his radio to coordinate the convoy's response. But even as his body acted with practiced efficiency, his mind was screaming warnings about the responsibility he was taking on and the lives that would depend on his decisions. "All vehicles, this is lead truck," Jake transmitted, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos around them. "Maintain movement through the kill zone. Do not stop in the valley. I repeat, keep moving until we reach cover." "Behind him, Sergeant." Reyes was fighting to maintain control of his truck as bullets punched holes in the windshield and passenger door. His driver, Private Collins, was a 19-year-old from Iowa on his first deployment, and the kid was panicking as enemy fire intensified around them. Tommy grabbed the steering wheel to keep the vehicle on the road while simultaneously trying to return fire with his M4 rifle. "Collins, keep driving, don't stop." Tommy shouted over the noise of gunfire and exploding ordnance. "Follow Morrison's truck and don't stop for anything." Lieutenant Chun's command vehicle was taking the heaviest fire, as enemy fighters concentrated their efforts on what they correctly identified as the convoy's leadership element. Her driver was wounded in the shoulder by rifle fire that penetrated the side window, and she was trying to apply first aid while maintaining radio communication with higher headquarters and coordinating the convoy's response to the ambush. "Overwatch Base, this is Convoy Delta 7. We are taking heavy contact from multiple positions in grid square 42 RQQ, 12,345, 67,890. She transmitted, her voice becoming steadier as her training overcame her initial panic. "Request immediate air support and medical evacuation for wounded personnel." But the radio response was not what she needed to hear. "Delta 7, this is Overwatch Base. Air support is committed to another operation and will not be available for at least 30 minutes. You are cleared to break contact and return to base if possible." Jake heard the radio transmission and realized that conventional tactics were not going to be sufficient to get them out of the ambush alive. The Taliban fighters had chosen their position carefully, establishing overlapping fields of fire that covered both directions of the road. Retreating back the way they had come would mean driving through the same kill zone that had nearly destroyed them on the initial pass. Continuing forward would take them deeper into enemy-controlled territory with no guarantee of finding defensible positions out in that moment. As bullets continued to crack overhead and RPGs exploded around the convoy, Jake Morrison was forced to confront the fundamental contradiction that had defined his life for the past 8 months. He had joined a logistics unit to avoid the responsibility of leadership in combat situations, but combat had found him anyway. The soldiers around him were dying because they lacked the tactical knowledge that he possessed, but was afraid to use. Corporal Foster was in the passenger seat of Jake's truck, returning fire through her window while trying to spot enemy positions. On the ridgelines above them, a bullet had grazed her helmet, leaving a groove in the Kevlar that reminded her how close she had come to being killed. She looked over at Jake and was startled by what she saw in his face, the quiet, unassuming supply truck driver she had been working with for months had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize. Jake's expression was calm and focused, his hands steady on the steering wheel despite the chaos around them. Most tellingly, he was talking into his radio headset with the confident authority of someone who had been in similar situations many times before. "Command, this is Morrison," Jake transmitted, his voice cutting through the radio chatter with unmistakable command presence. "We need to establish a defensive position and consolidate our forces. There's a rocky outcropping about 200 meters ahead on the right side of the road that will provide cover and good fields of fire." Lieutenant Chun's response revealed her confusion about the sudden change in Jake's behavior. "Morrison, maintain your position in the convoy order and await instructions from command." But Jake was no longer the compliant supply truck driver who followed orders without question. The situation had stripped away all pretense and revealed the combat veteran who had been hiding beneath the surface. His response was respectful but firm, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that comes from extensive experience in similar situations. "Ma'am, with respect, we need to get out of this kill zone immediately or we're all going to die. I'm taking the lead vehicle to the defensive position. Request all other vehicles follow my movement." The transmission was followed by Jake executing a tactical maneuver that demonstrated capabilities none of his fellow soldiers knew he possessed. He accelerated the heavy truck through a sharp turn that brought them out of the direct line of fire from the main enemy positions, while simultaneously using the vehicle's bulk to shield the convoy from a PKM machine gun position that had been targeting Lieutenant Chun's command vehicle. Sergeant Reyes, following in the second truck, watched Jake's maneuvering with growing amazement. The man who had been content to follow orders and avoid responsibility for months was suddenly displaying tactical skills that exceeded those of many officers Reyes had served under. His radio transmissions were clear and decisive, his vehicle handling was expertly coordinated with the terrain, and his situational awareness was allowing him to anticipate enemy fire and maneuver accordingly. "Who the hell is Morrison?" Tommy asked his driver as they followed Jake's truck toward the rocky position he had identified. "I've never seen him act like this before." The question was being asked by everyone in the convoy as they watched Jake take charge of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond Lieutenant Chun's ability to control. His transformation from quiet truck driver to tactical leader was so complete and sudden that it seemed like they were witnessing a different person entirely. Jake guided the convoy to the defensive position with practiced efficiency, positioning the vehicles to provide mutual support while maximizing protection from enemy fire. Once they were in cover, he began coordinating defensive fires and communication procedures with the kind of systematic precision that comes from years of combat experience. Reyes, establish a perimeter on the left flank and maintain visual contact with enemy positions on the north ridgeline, Jake transmitted, his voice calm and professional despite the continuing gunfire. "Chun, Call for artillery support on grid 42 RQQ 12,350 67,895. That's the main enemy position on the East Ridge. Lieutenant Chun found herself following Jake's tactical guidance despite her confusion about the sudden role reversal. His recommendations were sound, and his analysis of the tactical situation was more accurate than anything her officer training had prepared her to provide. But she was also struggling to understand how a staff sergeant supply truck driver had acquired the kind of combat expertise he was demonstrating. The defensive position Jake had selected proved to be tactically perfect, providing cover from enemy fire while offering excellent observation of the surrounding terrain. From their protected location, the convoy was able to return effective fire against enemy positions and call in artillery support that began to suppress the ambush. But they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Trapped in enemy territory with wounded soldiers and limited ammunition, it was at that moment, as the tactical situation continued to deteriorate despite their improved defensive posture, that the radio crackled with a transmission that would change everything. An unfamiliar voice, calm and professional, cut through the chaos of battle communications with words that made Jake's blood run cold. Convoy Delta 7, this is Reaper 6. We have been monitoring your situation and are moving to provide immediate support. Be advised, we have positive identification on your convoy and are prepared to extract you from your current position. Jake recognized the call sign immediately, and his heart sank as he realized that his past was about to collide with his present in the most dramatic way possible. Reaper 6 was the call sign of Colonel Patricia Hayes, commander of the Special Operations Task Force that Jake had served with during his previous deployment. Her presence in the area could only mean that his convoy had stumbled into the middle of a classified operation that he should never have known about. The quiet supply truck driver that everyone thought they knew was about to be revealed as someone entirely different, and there would be no way to hide his true identity once Colonel Hayes arrived on the scene. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the gunfire like thunder rolling across the valley, a deep rhythmic thumping that grew steadily louder as it echoed off the rocky walls surrounding the ambush site. Jake looked up from his defensive position and felt his stomach drop as he recognized the distinctive profile of two MH-60 Black Hawks flying in tactical formation, flanked by a pair of H-64 Apache attack helicopters that were already engaging enemy positions on the ridgelines with 30mm cannon fire. The lead Black Hawk bore markings that Jake knew intimately from his previous deployment. The distinctive unit insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known throughout the military as the Night Stalkers. These were not ordinary Army helicopters responding to a routine convoy in distress. This was a Special Operations Aviation Package, the kind of elite unit that only deployed for high-priority missions involving classified personnel or strategic objectives. Convoy Delta 7, this is Reaper 6 Alpha, came the voice over the radio, transmitted from the lead helicopter with crystal clear digital encryption that immediately identified the speaker as someone with the highest levels of security clearance. We are beginning our approach to your position. Mark your location with colored smoke for positive identification. Lieutenant Chun responded immediately, popping a green smoke grenade that billowed thick emerald clouds across their defensive position. But Jake could see the confusion and concern in her face as she processed the implications of receiving support from a Special Operations unit that should have had no knowledge of their routine supply mission. "Morrison," she called out over the noise of helicopter rotors and continuing gunfire, "do you have any idea why Special Ops would be responding to our situation? This was supposed to be a routine logistics run." Jake's response was deliberately vague, though his mind was racing as he tried to anticipate what would happen when Colonel Hayes discovered his presence in the convoy. "No idea, ma'am. Maybe they were operating in the area and heard our distress call." But even as he spoke, Jake knew that his explanation was implausible. Special operations units didn't randomly respond to conventional forces in distress unless there were specific operational reasons for their involvement. The presence of Reaper 6 could only mean that their convoy had inadvertently stumbled into the middle of a classified mission, or that someone in higher command had specifically requested elite support for their extraction. The Apache helicopters continued their attack runs against enemy positions, their 30mm cannons and Hellfire missiles systematically destroying the Taliban fighters who had initiated the ambush. The precision and coordination of their strikes demonstrated the kind of tactical expertise that came from extensive combat experience and specialized training. Within minutes, the enemy fire that had been overwhelming the convoy was reduced to sporadic rifle shots from fighters who were more concerned with escaping than maintaining their attack. Sergeant Reyes watched the helicopter assault with professional admiration, but also with growing puzzlement about the level of support they were receiving. "I've been on 2 deployments, and I've never seen response like this for a supply convoy," he commented to Corporal Foster as they maintained their defensive positions. "Those are some serious assets for what was supposed to be a routine mission." Amanda nodded, equally confused by the overwhelming firepower that was being brought to bear on their behalf. "It's like they sent the A-team to rescue us. I mean, I'm grateful, but it seems like overkill for 4 trucks carrying construction materials." Their conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of fast-roping operations as special operations. Soldiers began descending from the Black Hawks on thick nylon ropes. The troops who hit the ground were immediately recognizable as elite soldiers. They moved with practiced efficiency, carried specialized weapons and equipment, and communicated through hand signals with the kind of tactical coordination that commies from extensive training and combat experience. Jake watched the deployment with a mixture of professional appreciation and personal dread. He recognized the unit's operating procedures, their equipment configurations, and even some of the individual soldiers who were establishing the security perimeter around the convoy's position. These were members of the same Special Operations Task Force he had served with during his previous deployment, soldiers who knew him by reputation, if not by personal relationship. The squad leader who approached Lieutenant Chen's position was a master sergeant that Jake recognized immediately, Robert "Hawk" Hawkins, a career Special Operations soldier with more than 15 years of combat experience across multiple theaters. Hawk had been a team leader in Jake's previous unit, someone who had participated in several of the classified missions that had earned Jake his reputation within the Special Operations community. "Lieutenant, I'm Master Sergeant Hawkins," the squad leader announced as he reached Chun's command vehicle. "We're here to extract your personnel and secure your vehicles." "Are you the convoy commander?" Lieutenant Chun nodded, still clearly confused by the level of support they were receiving. "Yes, Sergeant." "Lieutenant Sarah Chun, 3rd Transportation Company. We're grateful for the assistance, but I'm not sure why Special Operations would respond to our situation." Hawkins' response was professionally neutral, but Jake could see recognition beginning to dawn in the Master Sergeant's face as he scanned the convoy personnel. "Ma'am, we received word that a high-value individual might be involved in this incident. We're here to ensure everyone gets home safely." The phrase "high-value individual" sent a chill down Jake's spine. In Special Operations terminology, that designation was reserved for personnel whose capture or death would represent a significant intelligence or operational loss to American forces. It was not a classification that would apply to routine logistics personnel unless there were circumstances that extended far beyond their apparent duties. Jake tried to remain inconspicuous as Hawkins continued his conversation with Lieutenant Chun, but he could feel the Master Sergeant's attention focusing on him with the kind of recognition that comes from shared combat experience. When their eyes met across the defensive position, Jake saw immediate acknowledgement in Hawkins' expression, followed by something that looked like surprise and concern. "Well, I'll be damned," Hawkins muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jake to hear but not for the other convoy personnel to understand the significance of his comment. "Jake Morrison, what the hell are you doing driving supply trucks?" Lieutenant Chun caught the exchange and looked between the two soldiers with growing confusion. "Sergeant Morrison, do you know Master Sergeant Hawkins?" Jake's response was carefully measured, acknowledging the connection while avoiding details that would reveal the extent of their shared history. "We've served together before, ma'am. Different unit, different deployment." But Hawkins was not as circumspect in his reaction. His expression clearly indicated that Jake's presence in a logistics convoy was both unexpected and significant. "Served together?" he repeated with obvious disbelief. "Lieutenant, Staff Sergeant Morrison is one of the most decorated special operations soldiers I've ever worked with. What's he doing in a transportation unit?" The revelation hit Lieutenant Chun like a physical blow. She stared at Jake with the kind of shock that comes from having fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly overturned. The quiet, unassuming supply truck driver she had been commanding for months was apparently a highly experienced special operations veteran whose background she had never suspected. Sergeant Reyes and Corporal Foster were equally stunned by Hawkins' disclosure. They looked at Jake with new eyes, trying to reconcile the modest, self-effacing soldier they thought they knew with the combat veteran that Master Sergeant Hawkins was describing. Suddenly, Jake's tactical competence during the ambush, his calm under fire, and his natural assumption of leadership responsibilities made sense in a way they had never understood before. "Is that true?" Lieutenant Chun asked Jake directly, her voice reflecting a mixture of confusion and something that might have been betrayal. "Are you special operations?" Jake found himself at the moment he had been dreading since requesting assignment to a logistics unit. His carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling before his eyes, and there was no way to maintain the fiction that he was just another supply truck driver. The truth was going to come out, whether he wanted it to or not. "I was," Jake replied. Quietly, "previous assignment. I requested transfer to transportation to do different kind of work." But Hawkins was not content to let the explanation remain vague. His expression indicated that he knew there was more to Jake's story than a simple career change. "Different kind of work?" "Jake, you were one of the best team leaders in the entire task force. Your tactical knowledge saved lives on more missions than I can count. What are you doing driving trucks?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an explanation that Jake was not prepared to provide. The psychological wounds that had driven him to seek assignment away from special operations were not something he could discuss in front of soldiers who didn't understand the weight of command decisions that had gone wrong despite the best intentions. Before Jake could formulate a response, the radio crackled with another transmission that made the situation even more complicated. "Reaper 6 Alpha, this is Reaper 6. I'm inbound to your location for personnel recovery. ETA 2 minutes. Hawkins." Expression shifted to something approaching concern as he processed the implications of his commander's imminent arrival. "Lieutenant, Colonel Hayes is coming in personally. She doesn't usually do that unless the situation is ... significant." Jake closed his eyes as he realized that his past was about to collide with his present in the most dramatic way possible. Colonel Patricia Hayes was not just his former commander. She was someone who knew the full details of his combat record, his decorations, and most importantly, the circumstances that had led to his request for transfer away from special operations. When she arrived at the scene and discovered that the high-value individual her unit had been dispatched to rescue was actually Jake Morrison, there would be no way to maintain any pretense about his background or his reasons for serving in a logistics unit. The truth about his combat experience, his psychological struggles, and his attempt to escape the responsibilities of leadership would be revealed to soldiers who had trusted him, Without knowing who he really was, the sound of an approaching helicopter grew louder, carrying with it the end of Jake Morrison's carefully maintained anonymity and the beginning of a confrontation with a past that he had spent 8 months trying to forget. The helicopter that settled onto the rocky ground 50 meters from the convoy's defensive position was not the standard Black Hawk that had delivered the rescue team. This aircraft bore the distinctive markings of a command and control variant, equipped with advanced communication systems and configured for senior leadership transport. As the rotors wound down and the dust cloud settled, a figure emerged from the aircraft that made Jake's heart race with a combination of respect and dread. Colonel Patricia Hayes stepped out of the helicopter with the kind of command presence that immediately dominated any battlefield. At 45, she was a career special operations officer who had earned her position through merit and combat performance rather than political connections or administrative achievements. Her reputation within the special operations community was legendary. Built on successful missions across 3 different theaters and a track record of bringing soldiers home alive from impossible situations, Jake had served under Colonel Hayes during his most successful deployment, the tour that had earned him his Silver Star and established his reputation as one of the most effective team leaders in the task force. She had been the one to recommend him for his most dangerous assignments, the commander who had trusted his tactical judgment with the lives of American soldiers and the success of critical missions. She was also the person who had approved his request for transfer away from special operations, though she had never fully understood his reasons for seeking reassignment. As Colonel Hayes approached the convoy's position, her eyes swept across the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had commanded combat operations for more than 2 decades. She took in the tactical disposition of the vehicles, the effectiveness of the defensive positions, and the coordination of forces with professional appreciation. But when her gaze settled on Jake Morrison, her expression shifted to something that combined surprise, recognition, and deep concern. "Master Sergeant Hawkins," she called out as she reached the convoy's command post, her voice carrying the authority that comes from absolute confidence in high-pressure situations. "Report on the tactical situation and personnel status." Hawkins snapped to attention with the respect that Colonel Hayes commanded throughout the special operations community. "Ma'am, enemy contact has been suppressed by air assets. Convoy has 2 wounded, both stable. All vehicles are mission-capable and ready for movement. Personnel are consolidated in defensive positions and prepared for extraction." Colonel Hayes nodded acknowledgement of the report, but her attention remained focused on Jake, with an intensity that made everyone present aware that something significant was happening beyond the standard rescue operation they had witnessed. "And Staff Sergeant Morrison? How does he happen to be involved in this situation?" The question was directed at Hawkins, but Colonel Hayes' eyes never left Jake's face as she waited for an explanation. Her expression indicated that she knew there was more to this story than a routine supply convoy that had encountered enemy contact. The presence of one of her former team leaders in a logistics unit was clearly unexpected and concerning to someone who understood his actual capabilities and background. Lieutenant Chun stepped forward, recognizing that she was the convoy commander, and therefore responsible for providing information about her personnel. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Morrison is assigned to my transportation unit. He's been serving as a supply truck driver for the past 8 months. I had no knowledge of his special operations background until Master Sergeant Hawkins mentioned it few minutes ago." Colonel Hayes' response revealed her confusion and concern about Jake's current assignment. "Supply truck driver?" she repeated, her tone indicating that she found the explanation almost incomprehensible. "Lieutenant, Staff Sergeant Morrison is one of the most experienced special operations soldiers in the entire theater. His tactical knowledge and combat record are exceptional. What is he doing in a transportation unit?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, demanding an explanation that Jake was not prepared to provide in front of soldiers who were still processing the revelation of his true background. His carefully constructed anonymity had been completely destroyed, but the psychological reasons that had driven him to seek reassignment were not something he could discuss publicly. Sergeant Reyes and Corporal Foster watched the exchange with growing amazement as they began to understand the magnitude of Jake's actual experience and reputation. The modest, self-effacing truck driver they had been working with was apparently known personally by one of the most senior special operations commanders in Afghanistan. His tactical competence during the ambush, which had seemed impressive at the time, was apparently just a small demonstration of capabilities that extended far beyond anything they had imagined. "Sir," Jake said quietly, using the formal address that acknowledged Colonel Hayes' rank and their shared history, "I requested transfer to transportation 8 months ago. Different kind of work, different responsibilities." But Colonel Hayes was not satisfied with such a vague explanation from someone whose service record she knew intimately. Her expression indicated that she suspected there were personal or professional issues behind Jake's career change that he was not addressing directly. "Different responsibilities? Jake, you were one of my best team leaders. Your mission success rate was exceptional. Your tactical innovations were studied by other units, and your leadership saved lives on operations that I can't discuss in present company." The praise was genuine and heartfelt, but it only intensified Jake's discomfort with the public revelation of his background. Every word Colonel Hayes spoke made it more difficult for him to maintain the psychological distance from his special operations career that he had spent months trying to establish. The recognition and respect in her voice reminded him of everything he had been trying to forget about his previous role and the responsibilities that had ultimately proven too heavy for him to carry. Lieutenant Chun found herself struggling to reconcile the Jake Morrison that Colonel Hayes was describing with the quiet, unassuming soldier she had been commanding. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what kind of missions did Staff Sergeant Morrison lead?" His personnel file indicates standard infantry experience, but nothing about special operations assignments. Colonel Hayes' response revealed the classified nature of Jake's actual service record. "Lieutenant, Staff Sergeant Morrison's complete service record is classified at levels that require special security clearances to access. What I can tell you is that he has served with distinction in multiple theaters, earned commendations for valor under fire, and demonstrated leadership abilities that made him one of the most sought-after NCOs in special operations." The revelation was overwhelming for soldiers who had been treating Jake as a peer rather than recognizing him as someone whose experience and capabilities exceeded those of most officers they had served under. Corporal Foster stared at Jake with the kind of awe typically reserved for military heroes, while Sergeant Reyes was clearly reevaluating every interaction they had shared over the past months. But Jake's response to the praise and recognition was not what Colonel Hayes expected from a soldier who had thrived under similar acknowledgement during his special operations career. Instead of pride or satisfaction, his expression showed discomfort and something that looked like pain. The psychological wounds that had driven him to seek reassignment were clearly still raw, despite the months he had spent trying to heal them in the anonymity of a logistics unit. "Colonel," Jake said carefully, his voice reflecting the internal struggle he was experiencing, "I appreciate the recognition, but I chose my current assignment for personal reasons. I'm content with transportation duties and have no desire to return to special operations." Colonel Hayes studied Jake's face with the kind of intense scrutiny that comes from years of evaluating soldiers under stress. What she saw there clearly concerned her, because her expression shifted from professional assessment to something that looked like personal worry. "Jake, we need to talk privately. There are things we need to discuss that go beyond the current tactical situation." The request was not really a request at all, coming from a colonel to a staff sergeant. But the way Colonel Hayes phrased It indicated that their conversation would address personal and professional issues that extended beyond the standard command relationship. She had recognized that something was wrong with one of her former soldiers, and she was not going to let the situation remain unresolved. Master Sergeant Hawkins coordinated the convoy's preparation for movement, while Colonel Hayes and Jake stepped away from the other soldiers for a private conversation. The remaining convoy personnel watched them with curiosity and concern, aware that they were witnessing something significant, but unable to understand the full implications of what they were seeing. Lieutenant Chun found herself re-evaluating every decision she had made regarding Jake's assignments and responsibilities over the past months. If he was truly as experienced and capable as Colonel Hayes indicated, then she had been dramatically underutilizing one of the most qualified soldiers in her unit. More troubling was the realization that Jake had been deliberately concealing his abilities, which raised questions about his motivations and psychological state that she was not equipped to address. As the two Special Operations veterans walked away from the convoy to discuss matters that the other soldiers could not hear, it became clear that Jake Morrison's carefully constructed new life was about to undergo changes that he might not be prepared to accept. The collision between his hidden past and his chosen present was forcing him to confront decisions and psychological wounds that he had spent months trying to avoid. The quiet supply truck driver, who had sought anonymity in routine logistics work, was about to discover that some responsibilities cannot be permanently escaped, and that exceptional abilities come with obligations that extend beyond personal preferences or psychological comfort zones. The private conversation between Colonel Hayes and Jake took place behind a cluster of large boulders that provided visual screening from the other soldiers, but the intensity of their discussion was apparent to everyone watching from a distance. Jake stood with his shoulders hunched and his eyes focused on the ground, while Colonel Hayes spoke with animated gestures that indicated she was pressing him for explanations he was reluctant to provide. Lieutenant Chun coordinated the convoy's preparation for movement while keeping one eye on the conversation that was clearly determining Jake's future. The wounded soldiers had been stabilized and loaded onto one of the Black Hawks for immediate medical evacuation, while the vehicles were being inspected for battle damage and prepared for the return journey to Forward Chapman. But the professional activities could not distract from the dramatic personal confrontation taking place just outside their hearing range. Master Sergeant Hawkins approached Lieutenant Chun with an expression that combined respect for her rank with concern about the situation they were all witnessing. "Ma'am, if I may, Colonel Hayes doesn't usually take this kind of personal interest in individual soldiers unless there are exceptional circumstances involved. Morrison must have been someone pretty special in the special operations community." Lieutenant Chun nodded, still struggling to process the complete transformation of her understanding about one of her soldiers. "Sergeant Hawkins, can you tell me what kind of operations Staff Sergeant Morrison was involved in? I mean, obviously within the limits of what you're allowed to discuss." Hawkins considered his response carefully, clearly weighing his respect for operational security against his recognition that Lieutenant Chun needed to understand the caliber of soldiers she had been commanding. "Ma'am, without getting into classified details, I can tell you that Morrison was the kind of team leader that Colonel specifically requested for their most difficult missions. He had an intuitive understanding of tactics and an ability to lead soldiers under extreme pressure that made him legendary within our community." The explanation only deepened Lieutenant Chun's confusion about Jake's motivations for seeking assignment to a transportation unit. But why would someone with that background and those capabilities choose to drive supply trucks? It doesn't make sense from a career advancement perspective. Hawkins' expression grew more serious as he considered the implications of Jake's career change. "Ma'am, special operations takes a toll on soldiers that's hard for people outside the community to understand. The stress, the responsibility, the things you see and do in combat, can affect people in ways that don't show up in medical evaluations or fitness reports. Sometimes exceptional soldiers need to step back and find different ways to serve. Meanwhile, Sergeant Reyes and Corporal Foster were conducting their own analysis of the situation while maintaining security around the convoy's defensive position. Tommy had been replaying every interaction he had shared with Jake over the past months, looking for signs of the exceptional soldier that Colonel Hayes and Master Sergeant Hawkins were describing. "You know what's weird?" Tommy said to Amanda as they checked the ammunition supply in their vehicle. Looking back, Morrison always seemed to know what was going to happen before it happened. Like today, when he positioned us in exactly the right place to survive that ambush. At the time, I thought he was just being careful, but now it seems like he was using knowledge and experience that he never told us about. Amanda nodded, remembering dozens of small incidents that suddenly made sense in light of Jake's revealed background. And remember how he always insisted on checking our equipment more thoroughly than regulations required. I thought he was just detail-oriented, but maybe he was using his special operations experience to keep us safe without us realizing it. The conversation between Colonel Hayes and Jake continued for nearly 20 minutes, with their body language indicating increasingly intense discussion about issues that clearly went beyond simple career counseling. Jake's posture remained defensive and withdrawn, while Colonel Hayes' gestures became more emphatic as she apparently tried to convince him of something he was reluctant to accept. When they finally returned to the convoy's position, both soldiers wore expressions that indicated their conversation had not reached a satisfactory resolution. Colonel Hayes looked frustrated and concerned, while Jake appeared resigned to developments that he could not control. The dynamic between them suggested that decisions had been made that would affect Jake's future service, regardless of his personal preferences. "Lieutenant Chun," Colonel Hayes announced as she approached the convoy command post, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made final determinations about complex personnel issues. "I'm temporarily reassigning Staff Sergeant Morrison to my task force for evaluation and potential permanent transfer back to Special Operations. He will accompany my unit when we depart this location." The announcement hit Lieutenant Chun like a physical blow. She was losing one of her most reliable soldiers, someone whose competence she had relied on even before understanding the full extent of his capabilities. More troubling was the realization that Jake's reassignment was apparently being made over his objections, based on his body language and expression during their private conversation. "Ma'am, with respect, Staff Sergeant Morrison is assigned to my unit and has been performing his duties satisfactorily," Lieutenant Chun responded, trying to maintain professional composure while advocating for her soldiers' apparent preferences. If he requested assignment to transportation, shouldn't his wishes be considered in any reassignment decision? Colonel Hayes' response revealed her conviction that Jake's current assignment was not in his best interests or those of the military overall. "Lieutenant, Staff Sergeant Morrison's skills and experience are too valuable to be wasted in routine logistics operations. The Army has invested significant resources in his training and development. His reassignment to Special Operations is based on operational necessity and has demonstrated capabilities under combat conditions." Jake listened to the discussion about his future with the kind of passive resignation that comes from understanding that some decisions are beyond individual control. His attempt to escape the responsibilities and psychological pressures of Special Operations had failed, exposed by circumstances that he could never have anticipated. The quiet anonymity he had sought was being stripped away by people who believed they understood his capabilities better than he understood his own limitations. Sergeant Reyes stepped forward with the kind of respectful advocacy that characterized his leadership style. "Ma'am, if I may speak for the unit, Staff Sergeant Morrison has been an exceptional soldier and team member. His knowledge and experience have made all of us better at our jobs, even if we didn't fully understand the source of his expertise. Whatever decision is made about his future assignment, we want him to know that he's been valued and respected by everyone who has served with him. The sentiment was echoed by Corporal Foster, whose technical focus had given her a different perspective on Jake's contributions to their unit. "Ma'am, Sergeant Morrison taught me more about military professionalism and attention to detail than any other NCO I've served under. He made sure we all knew how to do our jobs safely and effectively, and he never made anyone feel stupid for asking questions or making mistakes." Colonel Hayes acknowledged their comments with professional courtesy, but her expression indicated that her decision about Jake's reassignment was final and not subject to further discussion. "I appreciate your loyalty to Staff Sergeant Morrison, and I understand that losing an experienced soldier is difficult for any unit. However, the needs of the Army and the requirements of ongoing operations must take precedence over individual preferences or unit cohesion." Jake finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a resignation that suggested he had accepted the inevitable outcome of his situation. "Lieutenant Chun, Sergeant Riaz, Corporal Foster, it has been an honor serving with all of you. You're exceptional. Soldiers and I have complete confidence in your abilities to accomplish any mission you're assigned." The farewell was both gracious and final, indicating that Jake understood his transportation career was ending whether he wanted it to continue or not. His carefully constructed new identity was being dismantled by people who believed they knew what was best for him and for the military organization they all served. Lieutenant Chun made one final attempt to advocate for Jake's apparent preferences, addressing Colonel Hayes with the kind of respectful persistence that characterized her leadership approach. "Ma'am, isn't it possible that Staff Sergeant Morrison's experience in transportation has given him valuable insights that could benefit logistics operations throughout the theater? Perhaps his special operations background could be utilized in ways that don't require him to return to direct combat roles." But Colonel Hayes had clearly made her decision based on considerations that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. "Lieutenant, Staff Sergeant Morrison's capabilities are needed in contexts that require his specific expertise and experience. His reassignment has been coordinated with higher headquarters and reflects strategic priorities that I cannot discuss in detail." The finality of her statement made it clear that Jake's future had been determined by forces beyond his control or preference. His attempt to find peace and psychological healing in the routine work of a logistics unit was being terminated by people who valued his exceptional abilities more than his personal well-being or individual choice. As the helicopters prepared for departure, Jake gathered his personal equipment with the mechanical efficiency that had characterized all his military activities. But his expression revealed the internal struggle of someone who was being forced to return to responsibilities and pressures that he had spent months trying to escape. The quiet supply truck driver who had sought anonymity in routine work was about to be transformed back into the exceptional soldier that others believed he should be, regardless of the psychological cost that transformation might require. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the briefing room at Bagram Airfield, addressing a group of junior officers and senior NCOs about convoy security procedures in mountainous terrain. The PowerPoint presentation behind him displayed tactical diagrams and threat assessments that drew directly from his recent experience with Lieutenant Chun's transportation unit, combined with insights from his special operations background that he was now authorized to share in appropriate contexts. The audience listened with rapt attention as Jake described the indicators that had warned him of the impending ambush in the Peck River Valley. His analysis of terrain features, enemy tactics, and defensive positioning was delivered with the quiet authority that had made him legendary within the special operations community, but tempered by a humility that reflected his months of service alongside conventional forces who faced similar dangers with less specialized training. The key to surviving ambush situations is not superior firepower or advanced equipment, Jake explained to the mixed group of transportation and infantry personnel. It's situational awareness, tactical flexibility, and the ability to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information. Every soldier in a convoy, regardless of their military occupational specialty, needs to understand how to read terrain and recognize threat indicators. In the back of the briefing room, Colonel Hayes watched Jake's presentation with satisfaction and concern in equal measure. His transition back to special operations had been successful from an operational standpoint, with his tactical expertise and leadership abilities being utilized in ways that maximized their value to ongoing missions. But she could see the psychological cost that his reassignment had imposed, reflected in the careful control he maintained over his emotions and the deliberate distance he kept from personal attachments. After the briefing concluded and the attendees filed out of the room, Jake approached Colonel Hayes with the kind of professional deference that characterized their current relationship. Their dynamic had evolved from the mentor-protege connection of his earlier Special Operations service to something more complex that acknowledged both his exceptional capabilities and his psychological vulnerabilities. Colonel, the transportation officers seemed receptive to the tactical concepts, Jake reported with characteristic understatement. I think the training will help reduce casualties in convoy operations, especially for units operating in terrain similar to what we experienced in the Peck Valley. Colonel Hayes nodded acknowledgement of his assessment, but her expression indicated that she wanted to discuss issues that extended beyond the immediate training mission. Jake, I've been reviewing the after-action reports from your work with various transportation units over the past few months. Your impact on convoy survival rates has been statistically significant. You're saving lives by sharing your knowledge with soldiers who need that expertise. The praise was genuine and well-deserved, but Jake's response revealed the internal conflict that continued to define his military service. Ma'am, I appreciate the recognition, but I want to make sure that my involvement doesn't put these soldiers in situations they're not equipped to handle. Conventional units shouldn't be expected to operate at special operations tempo or risk levels. Colonel Hayes studied Jake's face with the kind of careful attention she had learned to apply to soldiers who were struggling with psychological pressures that didn't appear in official evaluations. Is that what happened with your previous team, the one that led to your request for transfer? Did you push conventional soldiers beyond their capabilities? The question struck at the heart of Jake's psychological wounds, forcing him to confront the incident that had driven him to seek assignment away from special operations. His expression tightened with the kind of controlled pain that comes from reliving traumatic experiences that have never been fully processed or resolved. Colonel, the mission parameters were appropriate for the intelligence we had available. Jake replied carefully, using the clinical language that allowed him to discuss the incident without fully engaging with its emotional impact. The tactical decisions were sound based on the information provided. The casualties resulted from incomplete intelligence and enemy capabilities that exceeded our assessments. But Colonel Hayes was not satisfied with such an antiseptic analysis of events that had clearly left lasting psychological scars on one of her most capable soldiers. Jake, I've read the classified after-action report. I know what happened in that compound. You made the best decisions possible with the information available, and you got your entire team out alive despite facing overwhelming odds. The civilian casualties were tragic, but they were not the result of tactical errors or poor leadership. Jake's response revealed the depth of guilt and responsibility that he continued to carry despite official vindication of his actions. Ma'am, those people died because of decisions I made. The fact that the decisions were tactically sound and followed proper procedures doesn't change the outcome. I was the team leader, which made me responsible for everything that happened under my command. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Chun, who had been temporarily assigned to Bagram for advanced convoy operations training. Her presence in the briefing room created an unexpected reunion between the three soldiers whose lives had been dramatically altered by the events in the Peck River Valley 6 months earlier. Staff Sergeant Morrison, Colonel Hayes, Lieutenant Chun announced with the crisp professionalism that had characterized her leadership style since their shared combat experience. "I wanted to thank you both for the training opportunities I've received here. The tactical knowledge I've gained will significantly improve my unit's operational effectiveness." Jake's reaction to seeing Lieutenant Chun revealed the complex emotions that continued to surround his reassignment from transportation duties. His respect for her leadership and his appreciation for their shared service were obvious, but so was his regret about the way his departure from her unit had been handled. "Lieutenant, it's good to see you again," Jake replied with genuine warmth. "How are Sergeant Reyes and Corporal Foster? I hope they're both doing well." Lieutenant Chun's expression brightened as she provided updates about the soldiers who had shared their combat experience. "Tommy made Sergeant First Class last month and is now the senior NCO in our motor pool. Amanda was accepted for Warrant Officer Candidate School and will be commissioning as a maintenance officer next year. They both asked me to pass along their regards if I saw you." The news brought a genuine smile to Jake's face, the first unguarded emotional expression Colonel Hayes had seen from him in months. His connection to the conventional soldiers he had served with was clearly deeper and more meaningful than his current relationships within the special operations community, despite the professional recognition and strategic importance of his current assignments. "That's outstanding news," Jake responded with enthusiasm that revealed how much he valued the success of soldiers he had mentored. "They both deserve those opportunities. Tommy has natural leadership abilities that will make him an exceptional senior NCO, and Amanda's technical expertise will be invaluable in officer positions." Colonel Hayes observed the interaction with growing understanding of the psychological dynamics that had driven Jake's career decisions. His sense of purpose and professional satisfaction was clearly tied to developing and supporting other soldiers rather than to the strategic importance or tactical complexity of his own missions. The recognition and advancement of conventional soldiers he had mentored meant more to him than his own exceptional service record or the classified operations he had led. "Lieutenant Chun," Colonel Hayes interjected, "Staff Sergeant Morrison's work with your unit has become a case study in how special operations expertise can be effectively integrated with conventional forces. His tactical knowledge probably saved lives during that ambush, and his training methods are being implemented throughout the theater." Lieutenant Chun nodded enthusiastically, clearly eager to acknowledge Jake's contributions to her unit's effectiveness. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Morrison taught us more about tactical thinking and situational awareness in 8 months than we learned in all our previous training combined. His influence on our unit's capabilities extended far beyond his official duties as a supply truck driver." But Jake's response to the praise revealed his continued ambivalence about recognition and leadership responsibilities. "Lieutenant, you and your soldiers had all the basic skills and knowledge necessary for mission success. I just helped you apply that knowledge in specific tactical contexts. The real credit belongs to soldiers like Sergeant Reyes and Corporal Foster who execute missions under dangerous conditions every day." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Hawkins, who entered the briefing room with the kind of urgent energy that indicated developing operational requirements. His presence reminded everyone that their personal discussions were taking place within the context of ongoing combat operations that demanded immediate attention and professional focus. "Colonel, we just received tasking for a priority mission that requires immediate planning and execution," Hawkins announced with the crisp efficiency that characterized special operations personnel. "Intelligence indicates time-sensitive targets that match Staff Sergeant Morrison's area of expertise." Colonel Hayes acknowledged the information with professional calm. But Jake's reaction revealed his continued psychological struggles with high-stakes operational responsibilities. His expression tightened with the kind of controlled tension that comes from being forced to engage with the very pressures and decision-making requirements that had driven him to seek reassignment in the first place. Jake will need your tactical analysis and potentially your direct participation in this operation, Colonel Hayes announced, her tone making it clear that his involvement was not optional. The mission parameters require someone with your specific knowledge and experience. As Jake prepared to return to the kind of high-risk, high-responsibility mission that had defined his special operations career, his expression revealed the ongoing internal conflict between his exceptional capabilities and his psychological need for distance from life-and-death leadership decisions. The quiet supply truck driver who had sought peace in routine logistics work had been permanently transformed back into the tactical expert that others believed he should be, regardless of the personal cost that transformation continued to exact. Soldier who had tried to escape his reputation and responsibilities had discovered that some abilities come with obligations that extend beyond individual preference, and that exceptional service often requires sacrifices that cannot be easily measured or understood by those who benefit from such dedication. 3 years later, Jake Morrison received a wedding invitation that made him smile for the first time in months. Sergeant First Class Tommy Reyes was marrying his high school sweetheart, and Warrant Officer Amanda Foster would be his best woman. The ceremony would take place at Fort Campbell, where both soldiers now served in advanced logistics positions. Jake attended the wedding in his dress uniform, wearing the ribbons and decorations that finally matched his reputation. But the moment that meant the most came during the reception, when Tommy stood up to make a toast. "There's someone here who taught me that real leadership isn't about rank or recognition," Tommy announced, looking directly at Jake. "It's about taking care of the people around you, even when they don't know they need taking care of." Staff Sergeant Morrison drove supply trucks with us for 8 months, and we thought he was just another driver. Turns out he was one of the most decorated soldiers in the Army, but he never made us feel small or inexperienced. He just made us better. Amanda raised her glass and added, "To the best truck driver in the Army, who turned out to be so much more." Jake realized that his months in the transportation unit hadn't been a step backward from his special operations career. They had been the most important service he had ever performed, proving that true leadership isn't about commanding elite soldiers in classified missions. It's about lifting up everyone around you, regardless of their rank or role. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is drive a supply truck and keep your mouth shut until the moment comes when you can't stay quiet anymore. What did you think of Jake's incredible journey from special operations legend to humble truck driver and back again? Stories like this remind us that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight. If you enjoyed this story of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected heroism, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who love tales of real human drama. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when someone surprised you with their hidden talents or background. We love hearing your stories. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads featuring incredible stories of everyday heroes doing extraordinary things.